4 True Bad Roommate Stories. Story 1. About 10 years ago, my girlfriend, now a wife, lived in a house with roommates. It was an old 2-story red brick house, as was the whole neighborhood, and I think the houses there were over 100 years old. The walls were painted a pale blue and looked old-fashioned. The wooden floors were old and creaky in many places. The house was divided into rooms, and each room was rented separately, so his roommates didn't know each other beforehand. It really was a random group of people who lived there. They shared common areas, a modest kitchen and 2 bathrooms. Each room had its own lock on the door, a solid deadbolt. I remember thinking it was a nice feature for the place, just to add a bit of security. One of Samantha's companions was Gaston, an older man, probably in his 50s. He was kind enough whenever I saw him. He was calm and seemed to be self-supporting. There was nothing about him that alarmed me at first, except that it was strange for an old man to live in such a house. The other roommates were young people who were just starting to settle down. Her room was right next to Samantha's, separated only by a thin wall. The sound traveled well in that house, but Gaston was generally very quiet, so it wasn't a problem at first. One night, around midnight, I was spending the night and we heard strange noises coming from Gaston's room. Loud knocks and moans that were not his own. So we got worried right away. We thought he might be sick or something, so we went to check on him. I knocked on his door, but as soon as I did, the noises just stopped. I stopped hitting right away, but I was still worried. I wanted to check it out, but Samantha thought we should leave him alone. I gave in and we went to sleep. The next morning, we were relieved to see that Gaston was doing well. I picked him up in the kitchen and we talked for a few minutes. I thought he might have been having a heart attack, so I was glad to see him. I spent the night again the following week, and before we went to bed, Samantha told me that the noises from Gaston's room had been happening almost every night since. He was getting used to it. That night, the same strange noises occurred again, but this time they were louder and even more intense. Samantha told me to ignore it, but I couldn't believe it was normal. It sounded like he was dying and he was terrified. I went to knock on Gaston's door again, but when I got closer, the door slammed open and hit me in the face. I stepped back and hit the wall. I almost fell, but I grabbed on just in time. When I looked up, I saw Gaston standing in the doorway. He was grunting like a maniac, and every few seconds he would tap his foot on the ground. But I didn't know why. What really scared me was that he had a knife in his hand. It looked like one of the big knives in the kitchen. He approached me in a strange, stiff way. I was still stunned from the blow, so it took me a while to react. But after a few seconds, I ran back to my girlfriend's room and we locked the door. We could hear Gaston banging on her for a while, but the door was sturdy and the lock held. Continued for about 5 minutes and then stopped. We sat talking quietly for a long time after that. We decided not to call the police right away. We decided to give Gaston a chance to explain himself. That behavior was totally different from him, and we thought it might have been some kind of sleepwalking or night terror episode. Eventually we fell asleep, but it was too late by then. The next morning we woke up and heard someone in the kitchen. There were other roommates, but Samantha thought it was Gaston. I was nervous, but I got up and opened the door. In the kitchen we saw Gaston preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. I approached him carefully and told him what had happened the night before. He turned very red and asked for forgiveness many times. He explained that he suffered from severe sleepwalking, but never thought it would become violent. I told him all the details and even showed him the lump on his head from the knock on the door. When I did that, she literally started crying. I wanted to tell him that he was fine, but the truth is that he wasn't. I didn't know for sure if he had done anything against me, but that's what it looked like. Samantha and I went out for the day and never saw Gaston again. He moved out before we returned. Her room was empty for a while and the house went back to normal, but we always remember that night. Samantha and I tried to look for Gaston afterwards, but we never found out where he went. I like to think that he went to get help for his condition, and that's what I think he did. Samantha and I moved in about 6 months later. By this time, a new person had moved into Gaston's room. We never told him what happened in that room because we wanted to put it behind us. When we left that house for good, I was happy because I didn't want to remember that scary night anymore. Story 2. This happened in my freshman year of college. I lived in the residence hall on campus, and in my flat we all had roommates. The rooms were quite large, so I thought it wouldn't be too bad. My roommate was Leandro, and he was the type of person who could absorb the energy of any room. He spent most of his time hunched over his laptop playing video games. For the others in our flat, it practically didn't exist, because it rarely came out and wasn't even introduced to most other people. At first, I tried to be welcoming. During the first week, I became friends with most of the people in my flat. I'm the outgoing type, so it's easy for me to make friends. Leandro was clearly the opposite, and it was difficult for him. She constantly asked him out with others, but she always said no every time. Eventually, I got frustrated and stopped trying. Our room was like a big square with our beds on opposite sides. We also had a desk next to our beds. Mine was right next to the window, while Leandro's was in front of the door. When he entered the room, he saw it from behind at his desk. I remember walking into our room one day just to grab something. I found him in his usual spot on his desk. He was on his laptop as usual, and he didn't even bother to turn around when I walked into the room. That's how things were for the first month or so of my college experience. It was a tense situation for me. I tried to avoid spending time in my room because of it. After a while, he just went to our room to sleep. As soon as I woke up in the morning, I would leave and not return until midnight or even later. Even when he came in late, Leandro was always on his laptop. He never seemed to sleep, or maybe he slept during the day when I wasn't around. I didn't know, and I didn't care. One night I was trying to sleep, but I couldn't. I was awake for about 3 hours, and it was the middle of the night. All the time I heard the clicks of Leandro's laptop keyboard. I opened my eyes and looked up at the ceiling, but I could see Leandro in my peripheral vision. From time to time, he would look at me and then go back to his laptop. I didn't move much, so I didn't know what caught his attention. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, and I left the room as soon as I woke up. A few months later, a friend sent me a link to a website. It was a forum similar to Reddit but less well known. I had never heard of him. I clicked, and what I found surprised me. There were pictures of me in our college room, some of them in my sleep. They were all shot from different angles, and even more surprising, there was one shot of me in the shower. Fortunately, it wasn't seen much, but it was still a huge invasion of my privacy, and I knew Leandro was behind it. I immediately told the supervisor of our floor. He was as surprised as I was and called resident services right there in front of me. She could hear a woman on the other end of the line, and it sounded annoyed, as if it was a nuisance to her. Maybe I didn't understand or didn't believe it. Anyway, the supervisor of my floor convinced her to find me a new room. However, I had to spend 2 more nights in that room with Leandro. Just the thought made me shudder. I tried to find another place to stay, but there was nowhere else. I was stuck with Leandro, horrible as he was. As far as I know, they didn't even tell Leandro what was happening. He didn't even know I knew. That night, I stayed in bed restless and anxious. The room was dark, except for the dim light of Leandro's laptop. Hours went by, and then, in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. I had the feeling that they were watching me. I turned my head slightly and saw Leandro. He was sitting on his bed, his eyes fixed on me, and in his hand I could see the faint outline of his phone pointing at me. He must have thought he was asleep. I stood still as I watched him take a picture. At that moment I got very angry. I threw the blankets and flashed the light. The sudden brightness seemed to surprise him, but only for a moment. I yelled at him, yelling in his face. I couldn't control myself. His answer was a muttered excuse. I don't even remember what he said. I lunged over to his phone, but he pushed it away and rolled over on his bed. Then Leandro took out a knife. I didn't see where he got it from, but it must have been by his bedside. It was just a regular pocket knife, not something big, but it was still scary. I took a step back, but not before the blade cut off my arm. That wasn't enough to stop me, however. I managed to snatch the knife from him. The fight was messy and I was bleeding. I punched him several big times in the face, leaving him pretty bad. I'm not a fighter and I've never done that before, but in the heat of the moment I just lost control. It's not something I'm proud of, but at the time it felt good. One of our neighbors must have heard the commotion and called campus security. They entered the room and took Leandro away. Despite my injuries and circumstances, I was expelled from the residency system. The reason given was violence, regardless of the context or provocation. Apparently, they had a zero-tolerance policy for that. Even though I was out of the dorm, I wasn't expelled from college. That just meant I needed to find my own off-campus apartment. Without a job or any source of income, that was difficult. Fortunately, my parents were willing to sign me into a lease. I found a small and somewhat run-down apartment. It was better than dropping out of college. The room was empty and the walls needed painting. The carpet was worn and thin in places. Life outside the campus bubble was different. I missed my friends and the parties, but I was seriously relieved to be away from the situation with Leandro. Although my off-campus life was more difficult, at least I didn't have to worry about security and privacy constantly. I made an effort to adjust to my new situation. I tried to stay focused on my studies and finding a balance in my daily life. Gradually, I began to feel more comfortable in my new apartment, despite its imperfections. Over time, the physical wounds healed, but the emotional ones took longer to heal. The betrayal and invasion of privacy I experienced at the hands of Leandro left deep scars. I had a hard time trusting others and became more cautious in my social interactions. As time went on, I tried to focus on the future and the opportunities ahead. Despite the challenges, I decided not to let this experience define my life. Instead, I strived to grow and learn from it, strengthening myself as an individual. Although my time in the residence hall ended abruptly and painfully, I learned valuable lessons about the importance of setting boundaries, protecting my privacy, and taking care of my emotional well-being. Story 3. After graduating, I found an internship in my field of study in the city and was living with my parents in the suburbs at the time. The trip would have been over an hour each way, so I decided to find my own spot. I started looking for rooms to rent on Craigslist. My budget was limited, so renting my own apartment was not an option. One of the few places I could afford was a room in a basement apartment with only one roommate. It wasn't a big deal, but it was close to the bus stop and it was only a bus to work. I messaged the landlord and we agreed on a time to make a viewing. It was a typical house, nothing remarkable from the outside. The landlord was a middle-aged man who seemed nice. We met there and he took me to the house, to the basement. There were electronic locks on the doors and it looked clean. It had the basics: a bed, a small desk, and a window that let in a little light. The landlord mentioned that there was a roommate, but he wasn't around at the time. He told me his name was Francisco and his room was right next to mine, but the door was locked. I accepted the room immediately. My internship started in less than a week and I was desperate. The landlord wanted the first and last month up front, so I gave it to him. I moved in the next day. There wasn't much to do because the room was already furnished. When I went downstairs, I could tell that Francisco was home because I could hear him in his room. Once I settled in, I went to his door and knocked just to introduce myself. To my surprise, he didn't even answer the door, he just ignored me completely. I was there like an idiot for a few minutes and then gave up. After that, I felt a little uneasy. I knew he was in there. I could even hear him from my room. After my first week, I still hadn't seen Francisco. On the first weekend, I finally met him. It was a brief encounter in the kitchen. He was taller than me and probably in his late 20s or early 30s. I said hello, but he just nodded and grunted. It was really strange. I had a friend at the time, so we just went back to my room and tried to forget about it. Our interactions, if you can call them that, were scarce. It seemed that we were operating on opposite schedules. I would hear the soft closing of his door at night as I settled into bed, or the faint sound of footsteps in the morning as I got ready for work. It seemed like he was trying to avoid my presence. Until that moment, there wasn't much to worry about. I was uncomfortable, but it was nothing more than that until the next incident. It was a typical night. He had returned from work and was tired. I went to the bathroom to shower before going to bed. Before turning on the shower, I heard Francisco's door open. Then I got into the shower, and since I was in the shower, I didn't hear anything else. When I was done, I left the bathroom and went back to my room. I sat on my bed and opened my laptop to see something. That's when I heard a strange noise. It was the unmistakable sound of a message notification from a phone, but it wasn't from my phone. I always kept mine vibrating, so I knew it couldn't be mine. I didn't know exactly where it came from, but it was definitely in my room. At first I thought a friend might have left his phone by mistake. Oddly enough, I took a quick look around the room to find the phone. Finally, I looked under the bed, and there he was, Francisco, lying on his back with the phone in his hand, staring at me. I backed away when I saw it, banged on the door, and the knob stuck in my back. I almost fell to the ground, but I got caught before that happened. Thinking quickly, I ran to my bed, grabbed my laptop and ran out of the room and slammed the door shut. I took the bus to my parents' house that night and never went back to that house. After consulting with my mom, I decided not to even go back for my things. I went out with my laptop and there was nothing more valuable. The next day, I spoke to the landlord and told him what happened, almost crying as I explained it. His strange reaction didn't seem surprised for some reason. I thought maybe he knew Francisco was a creep. Perhaps it was not the first time something like this happened. In any case, I told him that if he took my things out of the house and gave me back my last month's rent, then I wouldn't call the police. I kept that promise, but I posted an ad on Craigslist to warn others about what I went through. Maybe I should have called the police too, but I never did. I was lucky that he got a message while I was downstairs, because otherwise I would never have known. I could have fallen asleep with that guy downstairs, and if that had happened, I could have done anything I wanted. Story 4. As soon as I could afford it, I bought my first house. It had only been a few years since I graduated, but I was making decent money since I lived with my parents until then. I had a lot of savings as well. That was enough to get a small one-story house in my city. It had 2 bedrooms upstairs and 1 in the basement. The basement wasn't exactly a separate apartment, but it had its own bathroom and a small kitchen area. To make up for the mortgage, I decided to rent out the basement. That's how I met Vicente. He responded to my Facebook Marketplace post. Vincent was about 40 years old and very quiet. I remember our first meeting. Vicente arrived at my house on a Sunday afternoon. I took him for a spin for a few minutes, but there wasn't much to see. The deal was that the entire basement would be his, but he could go upstairs to use the kitchen if he wanted. He agreed to rent the basement on the spot, adding that the small kitchen in the basement was fine for him. I thought it was a good arrangement. We would have our own space in the house. He moved in the next week. I helped him a little, but after he settled in, I barely saw him. However, I knew I was there almost all the time because I could listen to TV or maybe it was video games. It wasn't strong or anything, but enough to know it was there. I didn't know much about him, but that suited me well. I had my life and he had his. We were just two people sharing a house, nothing more. I wouldn't say we became friends. One day, Vicente went upstairs. That was unusual. In fact, I think it was the first time it happened. We were in the kitchen together. He was looking at the floor and I was standing there uncomfortably. Finally, I asked him what was wrong. He asked me about the water pressure. He said he thought it looked weak. A random question at the time. I told him that everything was fine to my knowledge. He timidly agreed and then went back down to the basement. I was relieved when he finally left. A few days after that strange interaction, I noticed something strange. The plumbing was acting strange. The water drained slowly. I thought of Vicente when that happened. It wasn't exactly the water pressure, but it was related to plumbing. There was a gurgling sound in the pipes that indicated some kind of clog. I called a plumber right away to keep it from getting worse. When the plumber arrived, I showed him the problem in the upstairs sink. I know very little about plumbing, so after that, he took over. I left it alone to investigate. After about 10 minutes, the plumber told me that I needed to access one of the pipes in the basement. So I went downstairs and told Vicente what was happening. As soon as I did, Vincent was noticeably nervous. The plumber came downstairs and I went back upstairs. About 15 minutes later, he returned to where he was waiting in the living room. The first thing he told me was that we needed to call the police immediately. I hesitated because I wanted more details. Then, the man told me that he thought the pipes were clogged with a human body. He explained that he pulled out a handful of human hair and what appeared to be skin. The smell was incredibly unpleasant. The officers arrived at my house and I took them to the basement. The plumber came back down to show what he found. Meanwhile, Vicente was in his room with the door open. I could see him pacing back and forth, staring at the ground. By that time, I thought I was some kind of sociopath. With a glance into the pipe, the cops pulled away in disgust. One of them went to talk to Vicente. When confronted, he confessed immediately. He had killed someone. His demeanor was chilling, almost jovial. It was like I was a kid caught stealing a cookie. I think I even heard the words, "You got me," and then a laugh. I almost got sick. I saw Vincent being escorted out of the house in handcuffs. My basement had become a crime scene and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't live there anymore. That night, I moved back in with my parents. Police were there for weeks collecting evidence and recovering the remains. We later found out there were 2 victims. Vincent had tried to get rid of them through the toilet in the basement. How he did all that without me noticing, I'll never understand. I never went back to that place and ended up selling it for pennies on the dollar. No one wants to live in a house like that, not only because of how creepy it was, but because there are people fascinated by things like that and houses like mine become a target. I drove through the property about a year later and the house was demolished. A year after that, it was a parking lot for a small apartment building that was next door. That is probably the best use for such a place. I don't know who would have wanted to live there. The end.